Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Saturday, which doesn't necessarily mean it's because I'm doing this now, but that's what today is, if you didn't know that. This is the third part of the making of Fireflies, where we're going to focus on the mixing and the mastering, which is going to be a fun time because there's a lot about the song and stuff that I did that are weird. And not because, honestly, at the time, this was pretty much my regular way of doing things, but because it's been so long since I actually made this song, I have moved on to be doing what I believe to be smarter things, but we'll find out. So the orientation of things is pretty normal as far as what we see from my stuff. I have a sidechain bus where most things are going into. I have a drums bus where all the drums are going into. So the drums and the side are pretty much the two primary parts of the song. It's just that everything that's a synth goes into here, and everything that's drums goes into here, kind of thing. That's very loud. There we go. The part of this where it's sort of something I have changed since making this is that I usually put the things that are going to be the sidechain sources, like the kick and the snare, in the very earliest slots. And this is because of the way that my preferred method of sidechaining with the limiter works, which is that the way that it links which input is the one doing the sidechaining is not that it predicts a particular one and then it's always going to be that one. It predicts the order of the inputs. So right now, the kick is input number 2 into the sidechain channel. But if I were to move the kick to be before one of the main bass channels, which is before the kick, input number 2 would now be a different input, and the sidechain isn't going to just follow the kick like that. So that's usually why I make the kick and the snare the earliest inputs, so that no matter what I do, once I set them to be the sidechain channels, nothing will ever be in front of them, and thus they will always be, I can move whatever I want around, and it won't be, different sidechaining. Other sidechaining methods, like linking the peak controller, well, it doesn't matter where I put whatever, it's always going to be that peak controller. And automation, of course, is always just the same. So it's just a particular complication of using this exact method. As far as the actual sidechaining goes, it's pretty deep. It's important to note when we're using the limiter to do the sidechaining that I turn the ceiling all the way up, which is to say that it's not going to limit at all, and I turn the attack all the way off, which is to say it's not going to delay the audio at all, because that's what the attack does. And it's kind of important if you want to have a latency-less application of sidechaining, you have to be doing that. The thing is, though, is that the reason why I like to have latency-less applications is because I usually want to link some things to the sidechain and then also the master, which I am doing for a thing. However, I don't know what this thing is, but the thing about that is that I'm also using Maximus. And much like the attack on the master and Maximus, we have the attack on the limiter. I'm not actually using the master here, so that doesn't matter, but I am using the LMH delay, which is the exact same kind of audio delaying functionality, which means that there is latency in this channel now, and then linking the two of them just means that it's not gonna match up. There'll be a little phasing in there. However, I don't really remember why I'm doing whatever this one is. What is this guy? It's not that. Maybe it's the bass. Okay, so that's why I don't care about the phasing then, because it probably sounds cooler. It's also barely noticeable. That method of having something going into the sidechain channel and then also into the master is what I do when I want something to have a different sidechain profile. Not necessarily in terms of attack or release or any kind of time variable, but just like pure depth. Like how far down is the sidechain going? Because if you're doing this before compression, the maximum level that anything can be is always going to be whatever your compression is limited to, which usually for me is 0 dB. But then you can kind of bring the ceiling up and down based by how low you let it go. Because the sidechain will always be brought down, but then there'll always be that little bit of signal left over from the fact that we have the other guy in there. And if it were just an uncompressed signal, then everything would also just be proportionally louder. And then the depth would be the same, just louder. But because of the compression, we're able to do this. And what this enables me to do is to have only one sidechain bus for everything, but I can still make custom sidechain depth for stuff. Which, for this specific kind of stuff, where I'm using the sidechain from the kick and the snare as mostly a mixing tool instead of a stylistic tool. There's a little bit of stylistic, involved in there, but it's mostly I'm making the holes in the audio that fit the length of the kick and the snare. Versus if I were doing some kind of trance thing or something, or really slow dubstep that has a lot of pumping and swelling and that kind of thing, that might not be have anything to do with mixing. That has more to do with just the style and just the performance of the sound and kind of deal, which has more to do with time variables and motion than it does like the actual depth. And that stuff is usually manually controlled because your kick is largely not going to behave like that. Or you could use a ghost kick that does behave like that, and then you can still trigger it like that if you want to. There's a lot. Sidechaining has an incredibly large amount of like options when it comes to it. If you want to learn more about sidechaining, I actually have a tutorial called Sidechaining for Fun and Profit. And I do talk about some of that. And it's a tutorial about it alone. Yeah, so that's sidechaining. Before I talk about what I'm actually doing on the master, I have this Grizz beat, which I'm pretty sure I'm only using once. I want to point out that when I master something, when I'm mixing and mastering something, I usually put on the mastering as soon as I can, which is not to say that like this is anywhere near where the song is done. This is usually when I'm just making the song in the very beginning, when I'm pretty sure I made this part first. I really don't remember. I might have actually made the drop first, but my usual method these days is that I make the drop first. I make whatever the loudest part first, the bit that requires the most sort of mastering finesse or lack of finesse, depending on the style. And then I do that, and then I make as much of it that is representative of like the verticality of it, which is to say that it's got all the parts. It's got the drums, it's got the bass, it's got some arps, it's got the chords, it has everything in it that's going to be in the rest of it. And when I do that, I mix and master this one part like it's done. And then I put the mastering on, I fiddle around with it, and then when I'm making everything else, I have the mastering on the entire time. So that I know, I mean, the benefit of doing this is that I know what everything sounds like always. I don't have to worry about like switching between mastering and mixing and that kind of thing. And like, save for some extremely specific applications, there is no benefit to like rendering out your song and mastering the render than there is to just mastering it in the project. I've done both. I've done experiments. I've A/B'd it. It's not a thing. Nothing I can tell. There are mastering engineers that do use other kinds of software that do a lot more ridiculous things for mastering that like just other DAWs can't do. So for that particular reason, you might want to render it out. But if you're doing your own mastering and you're doing it inside your own DAW, the same DAW that you use to actually make the project, you do not need to render it out to master it. You can master it in the project, so they master in the project. There's a couple other things about mastering, like, for example, the idea that everything is loud as shit. You can even see that some of these things are peaking. Some of these lines are peaking. I have never really subscribed to the idea of making sure that everything is like, minus 6 dB or whatever. In fact, most of the time, I don't really pay attention to like levels of things. I don't pay attention to something hitting a particular mark, something else hitting a particular level. It's mostly I just do whatever I think sounds good. And something kind of hilarious happens when I do that, and that's that what my pre-masters sound like. Like if I were to turn this off and just listen to what the song sounds like without mastering. It doesn't sound that bad. But not only does it not sound that bad, it actually sounds a lot like what a final revision of a pre-master would sound like if someone sends it out to a master. I know a guy who's a mastering engineer. He actually showed me a track from another producer, and that was like the 12th revision. And because the idea that people have about the idea of the separate processes of being of mixing and then mastering, pre-master and master, is that when you're doing the pre-master, you're trying without compression on the master to mix all this stuff as well so that it sounds most like the finished product as you can without using compression. And that usually means that you're going to make it nice. You're going to make it mix the way that you want the final version to hear about it. The problem with that, because that does work, and that's been the way that people do it for, a long time with older genres. The problem with newer genres and more modern sounding things is that the way that we want our stuff to be sound and to mixed has everything to do with the master compression. Has everything to do with how that's playing out. And in fact, a lot about how that sounds are a lot of things that a lot of older traditional, more sort of professorial engineers would actually refer to being as a mixing and mastering mistakes. It's just we think they sound good. That's just how newer stuff works. So when the problem becomes when you're doing these nice level mixes, the even sounding good put together mixes, is that they don't translate well with the kind of compression that is what makes it sound the way we want it to sound. And so then you send it off to your mastering engineer, you get it back, and you do revisions and you make changes because you realize, oh hey, that hat needs to be quieter, or this is way too loud. I need to EQ this differently. This is why I do the mastering in the project, because I can just make those changes. I can see what they're like in real time. But if you make, it's being like, the drums need to hit harder and it's whatever kind of thing. If you just do all that with the mastering on and then you take it off, you realize that a couple of things tend to be true, which is that usually the drums are a lot louder than everything else. It just wouldn't have been a thing that you would consider to be a good mix. You wouldn't have done that. The individual elements like leads or things like that might be like way louder than everything else as well. Like just what is louder than other things and what isn't are stuff that you might not have considered to be like. There was no reason why you'd prepare a mix like that unless you knew that this is what you needed to do for it to behave the way you want and the kind of compression that you need to make it sound like you want it to sound. Of course, you don't need to make that decision if you have your mastering on the whole time and you're just doing it like that. So that's why I'm doing that. The other benefit is that, of course, when you're making a mastering really early in the song, you're not trying super hard to. It's just like it's super like scratchy. It's like a scratch mastering thing. You're thinking to yourself, okay, cool, it's gonna be a placeholder, and then I'll do more like important mastering later. The thing about it though, is that it's really hard to make a lot of decisions on the mix level, like really carefully intricate leveling and EQing and make phase changes and all these things that you're making to make the mix make the mix make a lot of sense, and then you master that, and you're trying to react to all of those decisions that you made. You're trying to make those decisions make sense in the context of the compression that you're putting on it. And so you have like this really complex thing going on, and then you're trying to like really heavy-handed make the compression do its job. The other option is to put a whatever mastering, like the kind of mastering that I do is it's not complex. There's some tricks involving the soft saturation, which I'll talk about, and that kind of stuff. So you make that, and then now all of those millions of decisions that you're going to make about your mix, you're making in context with the compression, which means it's going to fit perfectly with the compression that you created, just by your own ears and your own sensibilities. So that's why I prefer that. I'm not saying the other way is wrong. I'm not saying what anyone else does is wrong. I'm just saying this is why I prefer what I do. I also am saying that there's not a official, noticeable, measurable quality difference in doing it the way that I do it versus what other people have done. And also 32-bit float. The whole idea that at least right up until the end of your chain, the last step, the very limit of the end of your chain in the master, you can clip whatever you want into whatever you want, and 0 dB isn't going to matter. You have a lot of headroom above 0 dB at 32-bit float, which you can see that internally FL runs. You can see it up there. And it basically means you don't have to worry about 0 dB, which also means you don't need to worry about that whole minus 6 dB stuff, because you don't really need to care if something hits above 0 dB. The whole reason why nobody wants anything hit above 0 dB is because 16-bit, 24-bit, and MP3 and all that kind of stuff, they clip. You lose the information. But the 32-bit files do not lose the information. You still need to bring them down below 0 dB eventually, but you can just do nothing to worry about it. Some people have mentioned before the idea that not all plugins can handle that, have internal processing that deals with things above 0 dB, and you're totally right about that. But the metering in FL and the mixer inserts are all post effects. So if I have an effect and it's doing stuff and then it's clipping at 0 dB or whatever, I'll deal with that internally, and then coming out of that, the level can then be whatever I want. Because the only interaction between the post fader and the master is that the post fader goes right in the master, and then that's the end of that. So, of course, if you're also using a plugin on the master that doesn't work very well with, you'll know because it'll sound distorted and shitty. It doesn't work very well with things that go above 0 dB. Then you just turn it down. You can do that. You can just turn it down. Because that's the beauty of the 32-bit format, is that it can go above 0 dB, and you're going to hear it distort because your playback is 24-bit or 16-bit. It's your audio interfaces. Chances are none of you have an audio interface that runs at 32-bit, and so this means that you're going to hear it distort, but you can still just turn it down, and then your peaks will be fine. They're still there. But if you peaked a 24-bit file and turn it down, it would still be peaking, just quieter. So that's the difference, the primary difference there. I actually made an entire video that demonstrated that too. Just search 32-bit in my videos, you'll find it. Yeah, so in the mastering, my actual setup. Now, this is a setup I would say is not super smart. And this is before I really got on board with the idea of the whole separate sub business. And honestly, even if I did want to do a separate sub, I wouldn't have been able to for this song because I used the main bass. Like, I could have really carefully tried to figure out, like, the path. I don't have the file anymore, or at least I don't know where the song was that I originally created this sound, so I don't know what the MIDI path was. And, like, you know, I could have had, like, a, like, let's say this was the sub, and I had it, like, beneath here, and then, like, when I made the cuts that I made for the thing, like, I could still move them around with the individual parts and copy it and whatever, and it would have been in line. But I wasn't going to figure out what they were, so that meant that I was stuck with the bass performance that's actually in this file, which let's look at. Let's see what that's like. So what we're seeing there is that there definitely is bass. It's just not very clean. It's like when the filter goes up and down, it creates, I mean, it's phase distortion, and you can see it happening in there where there's a frequency that's not really a frequency, and it's going up and down, and like that's just the problem with a lot of processing on a bass, is that you don't have a very clean sub. That's the whole point of separate subs, that you high pass everything and you have a clean sub. I don't have a clean sub in this song, so how did I deal with that? Well, that has to do with why in my sidechain channel I have this Maximus. I mean, for each individual thing, it's got its own business going on. That's mostly a sound design related thing, where like the sound, yeah, you know, it's already a recorded sound, and then I have my filter on it, and then a chorus, and then reverb, and then I'm compressing it to like just bring it up. And I'm trying really hard to maintain bass consistency. That's what this like cut is down on the low end, and then me pushing it up as hard as I am, because I want there to be bass, and then the compression is not that intense. So then the other point of a separate sub is that if you high pass everything and then you only have one sub, this means in between all the other sounds that you have, all of the sub is consistent on every sound. It's just the same. It might as well be a different instrument. It's but if I'm not doing that, that means we have to carefully like calibrate every other individual bass thing to have the correct amount of bass. So that's what this is all about. So I have again this bass cut. It's on the sidechain channel. Now, by default, Maximus has a low cut built into it. Down here, it's at 20 hertz, so that's good. You know, you don't want stuff down below that, because you can see a whole bunch of just like non-tonal business happening down there. So then, so here we can see like what the bass performance is like in the track. So here's what the input's like. It's just fucking everywhere. If this were a sine sub business, it'd be a flat line the whole time, and it'd be great. But I didn't have that. So then I have this going on, because this is a slightly more consistent, because it did go high. It was too loud, too quiet, too loud, too quiet. So now this kind of just brings it in line, which is just what limiters are supposed to do. And that's just what I'm doing in the low end here, multiband wise. And then the mids and the highs are a bit more dynamic, because they can do that, but I didn't want the bass to be dynamic. I wanted the bass to be consistent. That's what I'm doing on the sidechain channel, where every single sound is going into. So that I have that kind of thing going on. And then I have this post EQ. This is all like, this is like a travesty of just processing, because for me to be having to do this on everything, on like a huge bus with everything in it, just means that I failed at an individual level to make things fit together. It's not necessarily like bad. It's not going to make it sound any worse, but this is like last resort, super heavy-handed like solutions to stuff that could have been easily solved at the individual level. Yeah, so then that happens. The drums, the way that they're handling the drums is pretty regular for me. I knew I was bringing the chorus in there. So yeah, you know, I remember the drums are from Break Tweaker. Doing his thing. So, and each of these has an individual out, so it means like all the instruments from all like the sounds, the drum sounds from Break Tweaker are coming out into here. And this is pretty regular stuff, you know, just pushing particular frequencies that I like in the kicks and the snares. My usual kick and snare mixing are just not complicated. It's not like there's not like a lot of utility, and it's mostly because the sounds already kind of sound like what I want. And that's like my advice when it comes to drums, because I don't make a lot of my own drums. I've tried. I'm not very good at it, and I mean, I might get better in the future, but for the time being, I'm a proponent of just finding better samples. And that could apply to a lot of stuff, not just drums, but for drums, that's just kind of my saving grace, is that we live in a day and age where somebody somewhere has made a pack of something that's exactly what you want. And you can do a good job, because you can, in reference to drums, you can polish a turd. You can try really, really hard to make something that doesn't sound super great to sound like something super great. You can do that. I just don't want to. So finding a sound that's already the way you want it is the best case scenario, because then you don't need to do a lot to it. I will say for snares, particularly what to pay attention to is the kind of basic anatomy of a snare, which is you have fundamental tone, sort of mid, low, mid, no man's land where nothing important happens. Sometimes if there's like metallic harmonics, they might live in there. And then there's like the clap range, and then there's the high frequency papery range. Not a lot of clap going on. It's pretty high, and the fundamental is very pronounced. So, like, if you want to accentuate those particular aspects of it, those are the things you need to look forward to. And, of course, if you're using analysis like this, it's pretty easy to spot where all the activity is. Lots of individual hats. I really didn't do much to the hats. I probably high-passed a bunch of them, just high-shelved. I didn't really push it too hard, because there's not a lot of stuff going on in them anyway. That's weird. I just noticed the kick is going into a thing and then going into the drums. I wonder why. But it's going in the drums, and I've got my compressor set up to kind of represent kick, snare, and hats. So the kick this is where all the kick frequency lives, and this is where the snare frequency lives. And remember I was talking about the analysis. They're just very easy to see where the split should be. When I make the splits themselves are not perfectly sharp. Even when you have linear phase filters on, they're not perfectly sharp, which means that you want to give a little bit of distance between the parts that you want to actually be in the section. Because if it was like right up in there, then a little bit of that frequency would also be in the low band, and I don't want that. So that's why I split it up the way I have. Now, when it comes to compressing things, as much as like, you know, the actual curve that you've got going on and the input and the output and that whole thing are important, one of the bigger parts that's important, especially for drums, is your time variables. In the time variables, these determine how fast the compressor reacts to stuff. So in the bass level, I actually have pretty slow reaction. And this is because if you can set the compressor to act basically what's ostensibly real time, and that's wave shaping. Because if the compressor reacts faster than the oscillation of the waveform, of whatever note you have or something, then it's going to shape the waveform because it's reacting at the oscillation level. So for bass frequencies, that's not all that fast because it's low level, it's slow. So then, you know, you want it to be equally slow, not to fuck with it, because then you get distorted stuff. And sometimes it sounds good, most of the time, not so much. So mids and highs can be a lot faster because they're faster frequencies. However, you might notice that I have a pretty slow shape going on the highs. And that's because sometimes kind of overcompressed, muffled highs sound kind of nice. Here's what it sounds like with the fast. Yeah, the other time variables matter as well. The head's pretty high, so that's why it wasn't so super pronounced. Ah, there it is. So now it's like really sharp. And the sharpness is not bad, but there's also something to say for kind of smooth softness that happens with slow parameters on high frequencies. That I dig. I'm also using the stereo separator knob here, which is a fader between mid and side. The mid being the signal that is shared equally between the speakers, which is to say a mono signal, and then the side being information that is unique to either the left or the right signal, which is to say only stereo. So all the way on this side, where it is right now, it's all the way mono, and all the way on this side, it's all the way stereo. And this is a nice spread. So like you want on lower frequencies not to have a lot of spread, because if it spreads, then you get phase cancellation, and then you lose your frequencies. So on low frequencies, you don't want to do that. Higher frequencies, so the mid's not super spread, and then the mid's is normal, it's just doing whatever it's doing, and then the highs spread more stereo so that it get this nice image thing going on. I like this about Maximus, that you're able to do that internally. It's very, very nice. On the master, I ain't doing shit. And this is because I want the peaks as they are to go into the master and to be processed there. I do that too these days. So that's what the drums are doing, and that's what the synths are doing. Like individually, what the synths are mostly, it's mostly sort of sound design decisions. And this is what I say about how mixing should go for just my own stuff, which could be useful for you as well. Which is to say that you have, because a lot of the same tools are used for sound design and for mixing. You could use a compressor to do weird stuff, and then you could use a compressor to do stuff that compressors are designed to do to make things sound easier to mix. So then you have a sound design level stuff where you're using equalizers to do incredible things that probably don't make a lot of sense mixing wise, and then you have the mixing level where you're doing it to make it work with other stuff. Because at the sound design level, you're trying to make the sound as good as you can get at the sound by itself. You're just making it realize its highest potential without any regard for anything else. I mean, you can have regard if you want to, but for the most part, I don't. And then at the mixing level, your job is to make that sound still sound like it did when it was by itself, but just with other stuff. And just by the fact that frequencies conflict and things are too loud and leveling and that whole thing, you got to do a bunch of stuff to make that happen. Which is usually why when you have a song like this and you hear it all together, it sounds really good. But then if you listen to any one individual element, you think to yourself, oh, it doesn't sound nearly as big and full as it does in the song, and that's because it has a whole bunch of other stuff propping it up. This is one of this thing happens. This happens a lot to people who are first getting into recording guitars for like metal bands. Is that they have this tone in their head that's very full and big and huge. The problem though is that tone is a result of the mixing process, not even the double tracking part. The idea that the low end is cut off to make room for the bass, and the high end is cut off to make room for cymbals and vocals and things, and the mid is scooped out to make room for the snare and that kind of stuff. So when it's all mixed together, it sounds super great, but when it's by itself, it usually sounds stupid. But people still make these ridiculously huge full tones, and then they try to mix those, and it doesn't work. So that's why that kind of consideration is also true for pretty much every kind of recorded music that you're ever going to do. You're going to have, those are the kind of relationships you need to have to make them work together. What I did here with the multiband compressor on the synth bus, with the sidechain bus, is essentially super heavy-handed ignoring of all of that, because I'm using the multiband compressor to ensure particular limits and particular behavior on each part of the band, where I'm, like, by sacrificing dynamics, I'm creating a sort of a mold that it's fitting into pretty much regardless of what it's doing. Not necessarily entirely regardless, but pretty much regardless of what it's doing at individual equalizer levels. And with all that combined, it finally goes into master. So you see that I have two Maximuses here. I have a gross beat, which is primarily for just I use it at one point. And then I have a global EQ, which is doing very slight, super light things. And then I have my two Maximi here. The reason there are two of them is because the one that I'm using the most of the time during the drops, it is super harsh. It's using the soft saturation, which I set at the ceiling to be 0 dB, and the threshold to be really, really small, which essentially means that it's distorting anything that goes past that line. Which, as you see, is most things. I have this ridiculously high dynamic signal going into a plus 9 dB into the master, and then it's being crushed down to 0 dB. Now, the reason why this works, the reason why I'm able to do what is just distortion on the master, is because a lot of the sounds are either really, really fast, really transient, sharp transient sounds like drums, or already distorted like all the basses. So with that in mind, this means that the little added extra distortion doesn't really matter. It doesn't break it in any way. However, during the smoother parts, like the intro or the later bits, we have some issues that need to be addressed. And so that's why I have the other Maximus. This is the light Maximus. I am still using the soft saturation, but I have the pre-gain noticeably less on some things. I also don't have the mids are not open, so they're not being saturated, because I'm also doing that as on the mids. They're not being saturated, but they are going above 0 dB before they go to the master. So like I'm basically doing a little bit more careful compression on the more careful one, and that's only going on during the intros and then the not drop moments and the in-between parts. And that's because those parts do not have a lot of overly distorted loudness going on. It had a much more delicate, smoother sounds, like, the piano. And you don't want that, because if those smoother sounds get even a little bit above the soft saturation threshold, it sounds noticeably distorted, as opposed to you can't tell because it's already distorted. So you got to be careful about that kind of thing. And these days, I'm careful enough to the point where I can actually just use one Maximus that fits the drop, and then I just turn stuff down enough that it behaves the way I want it to during intros. But when I can't do that, I use more than one Maximus, and then I automate when it's on and when it's off, in between both. That's why I have 2 of those. So, I hope this all made sense. I actually have given the spiel a lot to particular students who are talking to me about mixing and mastering. And it's also usually why I don't, I have one video that I used that I talked about mixing and mastering for in the production basics video. And the reason why I never wanted to make that tutorial is because mastering, especially, is something that is very particular. You can have a pattern, you can have a setup that you do a lot, but the decisions that you're making are very track by track, and it's hard to generalize that, at least in the way that I do it. And the only way that you're ever really going to be able to generalize it is if your music is the same always. There are producers who have templates for their stuff. Like Zed has a template where he can just turn it on, it's already good to go, and that's because a lot of his tracks have the same qualities, the same levels, dynamics, tones even. It all is similar to itself, to the point where he doesn't have to worry about making a lot of different decisions. But I do every kind of different genre, and I have to make every decision about it, even though the setup might be the same. I might have my sidechain sources pretty low on the list. I have my sidechain bus, my drums bus, my sub bus, go to the master, do the master before, work with the master. It's the same basic process, but all the individual complex parts that people want to know about are going to be different every time. Which is why I like doing these making of videos, because I get to see specific examples for a specific case. And that's what this one was all about. So long ago when I made it, long before I made much smarter decisions. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.